Well, as I've said before, things this week might get interesting. Then again, they might not. One of the things on the cards a lot of people are potentially expecting is that there will be a sort of rebellion from at least the die-hard, shall we say, Brexiteer headbangers, namely some, of course, in the ERG. Whether Boris Johnson gets involved or not, I suppose we'll find out this week. But what people are saying is that potentially any rebellion that the ERG might be able to mount would be incredibly small. Incredibly small. Some people have estimated it to be between 10 to 20 MPs. Now, don't get me wrong, that would still be quite a big rebellion, but it wouldn't be, shall we say, the end of the world. Ultimately, it would be passable. But, and this is the big but, is that these rebellions would continue and would start to build strength. A lot of people have said that even though Rishi Sunak may have essentially performed a miracle with his Good Friday, sorry, with his new Windsor Framework, rather than, of course, getting rid of the whole protocol name, because apparently that had become far too toxic. So it's now the Windsor Framework, has now essentially started a snowball rolling down the hill. And what people are now potentially expecting is that there will be some sort of token rebellion from the ERG, not being fully happy with this deal in particular, but having to live with it. But of course, that resentment will fester, as we have seen throughout all these this Brexit nonsense. This resentment about Brexit continues to fester, and it basically builds until, well, it explodes. That is what has happened in the past. So a lot of people are expecting that this will roll down the hill, it will get to the budget. This will combine with probably another rebellion about the budget that Jeremy Hunt will want to try and do, and will continue rolling on until we get to the May's general election. Of course, that's expected to be very, very bad. The polls are still very much not in the Tories' favour when it comes to this. And potentially this will just be something that builds and builds and builds until this snowball eventually potentially becomes an avalanche. Will that happen? Well, we'll have to see how this year plays out. And like I say, I am looking forward to my end of year review this year, see how crazy 2023 might get. Like I say, 2022 was, well, a crazy year indeed for politics, but 2023 could be just as interesting. But that's what we're not going to talk about today, because there's a lot of people, especially on the ERG side, all of a sudden accepting this whole new Windsor framework. And a lot of people are asking the question, well, why now? Why now? What has changed? Because to be honest, this deal is nothing new. This deal was floated by the EU a couple of times, and even by the UK government, to try and get this Brexit deal done back in sort of 2017, 2018. But people in the ERG absolutely flatly refused to accept this. So, why are the ERG now accepting a deal which only just a couple of years ago they would have called an absolute Brexit betrayal? So, today we are going to look at Conservative Home and maybe have a look at a piece that Chris Heston Harris has written, again, a former ERG chairman, has written about why he is accepting this deal, and maybe we'll be able to glean some insight as to maybe why they are now prepared to accept a deal just a couple of years ago they would have screamed and shouted about from the rooftops that this was an absolute betrayal of Brexit. So, as always, like I say, please do settle in, because I think this is going to be potentially a long one today. So, like I say, settle yourselves in. And of course, as always, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, please do remember to ring the bell as well, so you get notifications about new content when we put out or when we go live. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. And of course, the Patreon page. And of course, the YouTube thank you button as well. And don't forget the Pony Club as well. So, as always, let's go cracking on in to Conservative Home to find out why why Chris here has suddenly decided to pull a complete, probably something you could see from space, reversal to accept this deal, which just a couple of years ago, again, floated not only by the EU, but the UK government at that time, and was flatly rejected by them. Let's see if we can glean some insights from his from his piece that he's done today. So, like I say, this comes from the Conservative Home, and the title is Chris Heaton Harris. I'm a former ERG chairman, and here's why I back this agreement. So, in 2016, the British people voted to leave the European Union. In 2019, it was the Conservative and Unionist Party, led by Boris Johnson, that passed the withdrawal agreement, delivering on what people wanted, again, wanted, I think, in big quotation marks, and putting an end to the paralysis in Parliament. Again, let's go back to what people wanted. We've said it before, in 2016, the Leave campaign ran such a wide campaign, everything was on the table. And you know what's coming. If you've followed my channel for any length of time now, you know the now infamous Daniel Hannan quote that only a fool would leave the single market, because Leave is not talking about leaving the single market, because only a fool would leave it. And yet, here we are today in what is essentially a very, very hard Brexit position, driven very hard by people like Chris Heaton Harris. And they're now unexpectedly softening their position on Brexit, which should come as a surprise. And like we've said, a lot of people should be questioning, why now? Why now, when a couple of years ago you could have had Brexit, you could have had this exact deal that was offered to you by the EU? Why on earth are you deciding that now is the time to soften your stance on this? But anyway, certainly a question I think some reporters out there should be putting to him, or at least pretty much all these ERG members who are saying, oh yeah, we accept the deal. Well, okay, why now? So, from that point, England, Scotland, and Wales have been living free from EU rule. Again, this is a lie. Benefiting from increased trade with countries around the world and taking back control of our laws and borders. No. If you look at the government's own statistics, international trade with the UK, these other countries, is down. It's not increased, it has fallen. And for something that Brexit was clearly sold as, that this would be a return to Britain's glorious past as a magnificent trading nation, it hasn't delivered on that. So that is an absolute lie, that it has increased trade with other countries around the world. And of course, taking back control of our laws and borders, well, we have the level playing field agreement, which basically says you can't, shall we say, deregulate as much as you would like to, hence the whole EU retained law bill, which is another big question that people are wondering about. Has Rishi Sunak now said that the retained EU law bill will pass, or will that also be kicked into the long grass, just like the Northern Ireland Protocol bill? It's possible. We don't know, but we'll probably see, in certainly not only this week, but I think the coming weeks, what the consequences of Sunak doing this deal will be. So, back to it. So, for the people of Northern Ireland, however, things have not been so simple. It had become apparent that the Northern Ireland Protocol, put in place to avoid a hard border and protect the EU single market, was not working in the way that people expected. Well, again, I think it's people like you expected, Chris. I think people knew exactly the way it would expect. And we've also got to point out that it was the UK government not doing the not enforcing themselves parts of the protocol, which was meant that the protocol was not working. So don't try and rewrite history here, Chris, because this is something else the Brexiteers like Chris are desperate to do. Try and rewrite history to say, oh, Brexit wasn't our fault. We had nothing to do with this. So it soon became clear that it was creating serious barriers to trade within the rest of the United Kingdom. Goods freely available in Great Britain started to disappear from shelves in Northern Ireland. I don't really think that was the case, to be honest, but there you go. As traders tried to come to terms with the bureaucracy created by the protocol, affecting everyone in every community in Northern Ireland. The original promises in the protocol to protect the UK's internal market and protect the Good Friday Agreement in all its dimensions were also being undermined. Again, no, they were not. The protocol was expressly written to protect the Good Friday Agreement. So, once again, trying to rewrite history and say something which clearly did not happen, because the protocol was expressly written to protect the Good Friday Agreement. Not only that, this idea that businesses and people in Northern Ireland were suffering under the protocol, you look at polls, what people think of the protocol. You look at the last election for Stormont. People overwhelmingly are pretty happy with the protocol because not only does this give them the best of both worlds, but as Rishi Sunak said yesterday on BBC Radio 4, he went out and said, oh, look, the Northern Ireland being in the single market customs union will now make it an incredibly more place to attract business investment. So if that is the case for Northern Ireland, why is that not the case for the rest of the UK being inside the single market? This is something that I think questions, and I think certainly pro-European MPs should now actually start to ask that question. And we should, as again, people who are pro-European, actually now start to ask that question. If that is the case for Northern Ireland, if Northern Ireland is benefiting, which it is, we've seen the data, from Northern Ireland being in the single market customs union, why would that not be the case then for the rest of the UK? The tomato example is a clear example. The rest of Europe has a very much okay, fine tomato supply. We don't, because even Conservative Home today has also tried to write a piece saying, "Oh, it's nothing to do with Brexit. It's far more complicated than you realise." But even the writer itself has to go, "Yeah, it's to do with Brexit, but no, it's just really complex. It's just really complex, guys. But it's sort of to do with Brexit, but no, it's more complex than that." Again, trying to sort of deflect from the whole position that a lot of our fresh fruit and veg came from Spain and, of course, the south of France, where they can grow, these, your fresh, salads to be delivered on a daily basis. Same for your tomatoes. we said this back in 2016 that this would cause a problem, and oh my word, shock horror. It's just Brexit reality, not the Brexit fantasy the Brexiteers promised. So, back to it. So for the unionist community, this is more than a concern about goods on shelves. Many believe the protocol is pulling Northern Ireland away from the UK's internal market into the orbit of the EU single market. Well, it already is there. Even this new Windsor agreement does not doesn't move Northern Ireland at all. All that's mattered is that there's now these new two goods lanes that are now essentially in operation, and also an agreement for more data sharing, which happened, you may remember, a couple of weeks ago, where a lot of Brexiteers were shouting from the rooftops saying, how dare the UK government give away such sensitive information? This is just a capitulation to the EU. Bizarre how a couple of weeks separates them saying that to going, oh no, this deal's fine. But I thought this was a betrayal, because the UK has agreed to share all its trade data. Bizarre, but hey, there you go. So quietly, out of the public eye, and led by the Prime Minister, the negotiating team had been beaving away in negotiations with the European Union. making them aware of a very real impact the protocol is having on the people of Northern Ireland, and seeking major political as well as practical changes. Overall, while these changes are significant, um, I don't really see how this changes. Like I say, this whole Stormont break that's being proposed, we still don't know 100% how that is going to sort of work or operate. But a lot of people are saying that maybe this now gives the DUP incentive to go actually back into working in Stormont, because in a way they sort of now have more power being in Stormont, working within the Stormont system, rather than sitting on the sidelines refusing to get involved. That's at least the hope that is being certainly sort of fished by the Conservatives, who are hoping that they can put Stormont back into some sort of operation. Whether the DUP will actually agree to this or not, we don't know. As we've said before, I do not think this new arrangement meets the DUP's 7 tests at all, and they've been very specific about all those 7 points being met. So back to it. Over the past several months, we have made it clear that the changes are needed to make sure that the Northern Ireland Protocol works for all communities across Northern Ireland. The deal that we negotiated with the EU delivers that. So, why then are you now negotiating these changes? Because we've said before, this deal was put forward not only by the EU, certainly I think it was back in 2017, 2018, but also put forward by May's government and was shot down completely. Not only that, if this is meant to be a really good deal, why was this not the original deal to begin with that Boris Johnson came up with? You can see the questions that should be really be asking of a lot of these ERG and hard Brexiteers, because there has been, as we've said from the beginning of this year, very much this once almost solid Brexit voting bloc has now very quickly started to crumble away, as other political pressures and other sort of groups have formed to pull people away from this hard Brexit stance. It's becoming very interesting that this once idea of Brexit now as a potential voting bloc is very quickly falling away. And this is a massive opportunity for us, and certainly pro-Europeans, to sort of get into Parliament and start to push forward. Because, hey, if Northern Ireland is in a fantastic position to be in the Single Market Customs Union, then that exact same argument applies not only for us to rejoin the Single Market and Customs Union, but to be full members of the EU after all. So, back to it. It delivers the smooth flow of trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It eliminates the need for the cumbersome customs form for filling in the UK internal trade, but not for the EU trade. And of course, not only that, it gets rid of none of the trade, of course, if you are a UK business and you want to, say, send something to France, Spain, the Netherlands. Those forms are still very much there. And I want to point out again, if you are making that it is good to get rid of these customs forms, then that is yet another argument for being part of the EU. But hey, what do we know about all this? We've only been talking about it for years now at this point. So, and most importantly, it eliminates any sense of a border in the Irish Sea. No, it doesn't. That border is still there. Again, this border is still there. And I've said before, and we've talked about this before, if there were these sort of 2 lanes, one just going between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and the other for sort of goods that would go on into Ireland, that sea border is still there. It doesn't eliminate it. It's still very much there. And the DUP have been explicit, saying there should be no border in the Irish Sea at all. And that still applies to this dual lane system. So, do the DUP accept this or not? We'll probably find out in the coming, certainly, probably potentially this week, maybe even next week. We'll have to see. So, people buying food in Northern Ireland will now have the same food that is available to us here in Great Britain. Well, they already did, but there you go. The Windsor Framework introduces a solution on the issues of parcels, which can now continue to flow seamlessly when people send them from Great Britain to Northern Ireland without the need for endless paperwork. But again, what did we just say a few moments ago? What about if you're sending a parcel to Spain or France or elsewhere in the EU? That argument now applies for the rest of the UK, and I don't know whether this guy actually realizes it, but he's made now at least 2 or 3 times arguments for the UK to rejoin not only just the single market, but to be full members of the EU. I don't know whether he realizes this or not, but there you go. And it allows for the same plants to be available in Northern Ireland as in Great Britain. It removes the current issues that we've been having because steel is subject to an EU tariff rate quota. It also provides a long-lasting solution to the concerns of Northern Ireland about the supply of medicines. At present, a temporary legal fix based on EU rules does not provide guarantees of exactly the same medicines being available in Northern Ireland. Under the deal, medicines will be overseen by the UK regulator and avoiding the need for extra checks and different packaging for medicine in Northern Ireland. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, we haven't seen the full details around this, but if you're saying that this is the case and that you do not need separate labeling and separate packaging for medication, does this mean that the UK is going to follow the same medicines rules and regulations as the EU, which we said at the beginning calls in question to the whole retained EU law bill that is going into sort of the House of Lords? This is something, again, we will probably find out in the next coming weeks or days what happens, particularly to those Northern Ireland Protocol Bill and, of course, the EU retained law bill. What happens to those bills? They might, shall we say, just suddenly disappear very quickly or just be kicked into the long grass somewhere. We don't know. So, a deal also ensures that people's vets can now move freely between Northern Ireland and Great Britain without a passport. Well, what about Great Britain and the EU? Because here's the thing. If you're taking a pet into Northern Ireland and then you go, okay, I'm going to go from Northern Ireland into the EU, then what happens? I think there's still big questions in and around that because you will obviously need a pet passport. We don't really know how that's, again, fully going to work. There's still big questions, but we've only seen small parts of it. It's only, I think, 25 pages essentially have been released at the moment. The big legal text, I think, is meant to be dropping today at some point or potentially later this week. But again, we'll see how that works out. I don't see how some of that is fully possible, because if you bring your pet from the UK to Northern Ireland, what then if you go into Ireland? Technically, you're crossing into the EU. What are how do you stop this? And again, it's still the concerns now that you've got this dual lane system. How do you know that goods are not going to be going from the UK to Northern Ireland, then into the EU from there? I think there's a lot more detail that still needs to be seen, and I think there's a lot of more concerns that still need to be addressed in this. So we'll probably find out just how these questions are solved probably in the coming weeks. Certainly for that. So back to it. So we have taken back control of the VAT and exercise for the whole UK, and ended the problem of the quote reach back via EU state and state aid rules. Those state aid rules are still in place. And then this is the fun because this is the fun one because I do not think this is true at all. I think this is a claim that a lot of people in the ERG and hard Brexiteers, oh pardon me, are making, but I do not think this is true at all. That we have disapplied thousands of pages of EU law. I do not think that is the case. I do not think that is the case at all, because we still now have on the books EU laws. So you haven't gotten rid of any of these EU laws. The Northern Ireland is still in the single market. It will still have to follow EU rules and laws and regulations when that comes to it. And as I've said before, there's a lot of stuff in regards to this. How does that work? How does this Stormont break, as it's being told? How does that work? What does it mean if, let's say, the EU brings in a law and then Stormont goes, "We're not going to follow that law"? What happens, or what if they decide to sort of follow that law in regards to sort of the rest of the UK? How does that then affect the whole red and blue lanes situation? There's a lot of questions in and around this whole new Windsor framework that still, I think, need to be asked about that. So back to it. So the 3% that remains is to ensure single market access. I question that claim that, again, thousands of pages of EU law have been gotten rid of, and there's only it's only 3%. No, I question that very, very much. But we'll see again how those questions actually work out probably in the next couple of days as we get more information. So it is key to the tens of thousands of jobs in Northern Ireland and ensures its future prosperity, as they are in businesses that rely on Northern Ireland's ability to simply trade over the border with the EU. Just what? You could. Okay, let me read this question, but rephrase some of these things. So, it is key to tens of thousands of jobs in the UK, and it is ensuring its future prosperity, as they are in businesses that rely on the UK's ability to trade simply over the border with the EU. Can you just see how we've said all throughout this a couple of times? He has made cases for us not just rejoining the single market, but the EU as well. And I don't know whether he actually realizes this or not. It just, as we always said when when we left, us going back into the EU, just a matter of time. All that matters really is the amount of resistance. And to be honest, if the Brexiteers are falling over like this at the moment, then us rejoining the EU is going to happen a lot quicker than I think a lot of people really expected, to be honest, at this point. So, as a Brexiteer, I believe that all parts of the Union should have the same freedoms that Brexit has afforded to us. So, we have put in place a mechanism that will allow for Northern Ireland Assembly to ensure the sovereignty of Northern Ireland is maintained should a law look like it might threaten that. The Assembly can vote using mechanisms derived from the Belfast Good Friday Agreement to block damaging new laws coming into effect. Again, what happens if they do that? What's the reaction from the EU going to be? How does that then affect the border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland? You say, oh, there's no checks. Well, all of a sudden there might be more checks that suddenly apply depending on that law. And not only that, I think when you see that people in Northern Ireland are very much in favor of being in the EU single market and customs union, there is no reason I can see, just like when we were in the EU, when we had all this EU law and legislation that was passed by Parliament time and time again, yet sure, that's fine, pass it, no problem. I cannot see Northern Ireland going against these laws or regulations. because you have seen overwhelmingly the people in Northern Ireland wanted to be part and remain part of the European Union. So, and it closes the democratic deficit. I think it opens up new potential problems, but we'll see what happens there. Certainly, giving Northern Ireland more than a say, but an ability to act. Again, um, what what happens? We'll have to sort of refer certainly to experts what would happen, of course, in that regard. If sort of the Northern Ireland Assembly went no to that law, what then happens? Because there will be consequences. You know, there will be consequences if they say no. Um, and I wonder what happens then. I really do wonder what happens then. So let's finish this off then. So, as a lifelong Eurosceptic and former chairman of the European Research Group, I support this deal very strongly. Again, as we said at the beginning, why now? Why do you support a deal that just a few years ago you were saying was a complete Brexit betrayal? It removes the need for the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill because it ends all trade barriers and protects our union. I know that over the coming days and weeks, my fellow Eurosceptics will rightly want to assess the deal that has been negotiated. I'm sure that once they have done so, they will see that the deal is a deal that will allow Northern Ireland to prosper while strengthening our bonds that tie our union together. Again, quotes about wanting to potentially UK rejoin the EU. There's that entire article. I'm sorry. There are so many arguments, as you saw there. You could just apply the same to the UK to trade with the EU. And that exact same argument would be the exact same argument that applies for us being part not only the single market, but rejoining the EU. And bear in mind, if the Brexiteers are now willing to be this soft, it now raises questions where you may remember just a couple of weeks ago, Rishi Sunak wanted to do Swiss-style deals with the EU. You know, Keir Starmer has said that he wants to do more alignment deals with the EU so that we end up following the same rules and regulations, so it eases trade. And all of a sudden, and I am guilty. I will admit and say I am guilty of this. I thought the ERG would still be somewhat of a political force in the UK sort of government parliament. But I'll tell you what, I think over the past, certainly this year, I think they've seen that they've seen the polls. They know that Brexit has been damaging. They know that ultimately they will be the ones held responsible for this. Hence why we even saw in this article trying to change the past, trying to change history, to say we had nothing to do with this. If the ERG are now this soft, it does raise some serious questions now of pro conservative Europeans could now re-enter into the parliamentary party and push not only for more alignment with the EU, but even eventually fully rejoining sort of the single market and even eventually rejoining the EU. Because Chris Eaton Harris here in this piece has made arguments that if you change, Northern Ireland to the UK, apply exactly to the many situations that UK businesses find themselves in. So but that is the bizarre situation I suppose we find ourselves in. And I suppose a question I would love seen to put to these ERG people who are now sort of saying, oh yeah, no, that deal's fine. Well, why is this deal fine now when you were crying betrayal just a couple of not only a couple of months ago, but years ago, regarding some of these things that had been implemented in around this? It's would be an interesting question to see them try and worm themselves out of this. And I know Steve Baker, when he was talking about this, apparently burst out into tears, saying that, oh, this is a fantastic deal. There's a rumor going around, apparently, that Baker was seen in the corners of Westminster and with a couple of other ERG members saying that he was crying because he knew this was the beginning of the end of Brexit. That the entire political revolution had that they had wanted had failed. So just as we've talked about that one day our path would lead us back into the EU, even hardcore Brexiteers are, I think, recognizing that, and maybe they know that maybe they cannot stop our inevitable, uh, rejoining, but maybe they can do things like this that maybe might slow it down. But as I've said, there's arguments he makes in this blog which would apply directly to the UK and to UK businesses and to increasing our prosperity. So yeah, um, what the ERG's reaction to this is going to be, we'll probably see a reaction. There might be some sort of like token rebellion over this. Will this snowball into potentially larger rebellion come the May local elections, depending how bad those are? Potentially, we will certainly be seeing a rebellion over the budget that Sunak and Hunt are going to want to try and pass in it, certainly in a couple of months' time. it it could all go very interesting this year, but certainly this is an interesting point, and it is certainly very interesting to see hardcore Brexiteers climb down from a position over which something a couple of years ago they would have absolutely flatly refused. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. It has been a bit of a long one today, but again, thanks for sticking with me if you've sort of made it to the end. But of course, as always, thank you very much for watching, and of course, we'll see you all next time.